Today I'm going to show you how to tap birch sap from birch trees and then use that to make an incredible birch sap syrup. Birch syrup is quite a similar process to how maple syrup is made, but then it's quite a distinct and different finished flavour that you get. Both come from trees of course, and a lot of their character comes from the tree itself as well as their location. To me, birch syrup is a touch more savoury than maple, and it has a nice dry tannic note, a bit like a black tea. It's quite sweet, nutty and toasted with these soft toffee and vanilla flavours and just a subtle tartness and minerality to it. So now I'll show you the process of tapping the birch trees and then taking that sap and making the birch syrup, which to me is this really precious, luxurious product that captures some of the magic of nature and this fleeting moment of the winter turning to spring. So to collect our birch sap, we need to visit well-established, thick, healthy birch trees, just at the point where they're producing sap, ready to burst into life in the spring. In the UK, the right time for this is usually the first few weeks of March, but it's going to vary a little bit depending on where you are in the country, what the climate's like, and what the winter's been like. To actually tap and collect our birch sap, we need to drill a small hole in the tree. You should do this about a metre up and at a slight upwards angle, just a couple of centimetres into the tree. At the right time of year with a good flow of sap, you'll see it start to drip from the hole immediately. And we can safely tap some of this sap through the process I'll show you, and then I'll cover a couple more details and considerations about this at the end. So now I can tap a spile into this hole. The spiles that I'm using are these stainless steel tapered tubes that are made specifically for this purpose. You can order these online and it's a good thing to invest in if you might do this regularly, but otherwise you could just use an 8mm pipe connector for the same purpose. And then to this I add some food grade piping to direct the flow of the sap, and of course you should make sure that you properly clean and sterilise everything between uses. And then our pipe can safely lead our drips of birch sap down into a bottle or jar for us to collect. I've got some nice 5-litre jars with a hole in the lid just the right size for the pipes, but really a large water bottle or any vessel would do. You want to secure your bottles or jars on a sturdy base or by tying them in place to make sure that they can't fall over, because we're going to leave them for a full 24 hours to slowly collect the sap. Over that time the sap will continue to drip into the container, gradually filling it up, and then after 24 hours we can return and collect it. If you need a lot of sap, then you might have to tap multiple trees at once, but don't let them go for longer than 24 hours at a time, and you also shouldn't return to the same tree within 3 years of having last tapped it. If you're visiting multiple trees, you should clean the drill bit with strong alcohol in between to keep it clean and sanitary for the trees. And then really importantly, when we return to collect our sap, we need to plug that hole that we made in the tree too, so that we're not leaving it exposed. That's done by taking a small piece of a branch from the same tree, whittling it down a little bit, and then tapping it into the hole in the tree to seal it nicely, stop the flow of sap, and prevent the tree from any risk of infection. Now that we have our birch sap water, that's just the first step in the process for me. Interestingly, the birch water itself is only very slightly sweet before we reduce it, about 0.5 to 1% sugar. And you can drink it just like this. It's really fresh and hydrating, but definitely my favourite thing to do with it is to reduce it down to make this delicious complex birch syrup, and that's what I'll show you now. So to make our syrup, first off we'll just filter the birch sap. It's very clear anyway, and I used covered bottles, but it's still worth doing. Then we're going to bring the sap to a simmer in a large pan and begin the long, slow process of reducing and concentrating it. To give you a sense of just how far we'll reduce this, 10 litres of the sap is going to give us just 100ml of the finished birch syrup. This is part of why it's such a precious and luxurious ingredient to me. It takes quite a lot of effort to get it to its final state. It's a lot of birch sap to collect, transport and reduce to make quite a small, but definitely worth it, batch of the syrup. Because we have to reduce the sap so much, I think the most practical way to think about this is in 2 stages. This first stage of reduction is about getting a large amount of liquid down to a smaller, more manageable amount. It's going to take several hours, and so you can just leave a large pan going and just occasionally keep coming and checking back on it. But then once you get down to that last 5 to 10% of the liquid, that's when you really need to start keeping a close eye on it. Once it's reduced this far, things start to get quite a lot more exciting. You'll see that its colour has started to change, and you'll get these much more noticeable aromas of vanilla, toasted wood and sweet tea. But from here, we also enter the point where if you take your eye off it, it could easily over-reduce and burn, which would be devastating, wasting your precious birch sap and all the effort you've put in up to this point. So now, probably the best approach for most people is going to be to transfer this liquid over to a smaller pan that you can then continue to heat over a medium heat, watching it pretty constantly through this final stage. I've also heard of people doing this last stage of reduction using the microwave so that you take away the risk of it burning on the direct heat of the stove. Or, because I'm super fancy, super easily distracted, and have a rotovap on hand, I've used that to finish this final stage of reduction before. That just lets me do the last stage of the reduction over a water bath, so there's no chance of me scorching the syrup, and I don't have to keep quite as close an eye on it. If you don't know what the rotovap is, absolutely do not worry about it. It is not necessary for this process at all, and for most people, just finishing this off in a smaller pan is going to work great. To tell when the syrup is ready, I personally like the consistency of measuring the Brix/sugar content of the syrup. I'm aiming for 61 to 62 degrees Brix, or percentage sugar, and I just use a cheap refractometer to measure a cool drop of the syrup to measure this. But if you're going to do this more casually just for home use, you could just judge it by colour and taste, and it's ready when you like it. Once you've finished making the syrup, let it cool. It's going to thicken up a little bit during that process, and then you can store it long term in sterilised jars or bottles. So that's my finished birch sap syrup, and I'm going to show you how I actually use this on my menu in a separate future video, because I think that's going to be worth spending a little bit of time on and exploring properly. But it can be quite easily used in either savoury or sweet applications, or even cocktails. And because of its complexity of flavour and its slight tannin notes, it really brings something special and unique to the right dishes. I can't wait to show you how I use mine in the near future, but in the meantime, you might be interested in some of my other videos on how I work with wild foods, so I'll put links to some of those down in the video description. I love working with things like nettles to make dashi and for my modern take on a nettle soup. Or in the spring, using spruce tips to make sorbets, or dandelion petals to make these little dandelion petal pastels that I use to open my tasting menu. And just lastly, I want to quickly go over a couple of considerations which boil down to looking after the birch trees and looking after yourselves. I mentioned before that you shouldn't visit the same tree again after tapping it for another 3 years to give it plenty of time to recover, and with birch being so plentiful, this shouldn't be necessary anyway. I also want to re-emphasise the importance of closing up the holes after you've tapped a birch tree, and it's our responsibility if we're working with wild foods and nature to make sure that we're looking after it and not leaving it vulnerable. And in terms of looking after yourselves, before you embark on anything to do with wild food, you should always make sure that you are really confident in identifying the plants or trees that you're working with. You can go on courses or get apps and books that will help to teach you about this, and it's important that you confidently know what you're doing. And you should check the regulations in your area to make sure that you are allowed to do this, whether that's on public land or getting the permission of private landowners. So I hope that you've enjoyed the video and found it helpful, and if you have, I mentioned the other wild food videos I have, but then I also cover topics like fermentation, or you can see videos that I've made about whole dishes off my tasting menu. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.